A crown can be stolen by ambition, but it can only be taken by the moon when a king betrays his own soul. The voice echoed across the ancient stone courtyard like distant thunder, and every wolf in the kingdom instinctively lowered their head beneath the pale silver light. At the center of the Royal Moon Plaza, King Alpha Nathaniel Ashford knelt in complete silence. The magnificent crown that had rested upon his head only moments before now lay cracked across the marble floor, its once brilliant moonstone dim and lifeless. Thousands of members of the pack surrounded the plaza, yet no one dared whisper. Above them, the full moon glowed brighter than anyone had ever witnessed, bathing the kingdom in a cold, sacred light that carried an authority greater than any king. Nathaniel slowly lifted his eyes toward the heavens, but the familiar warmth he had always felt beneath the moon goddess had vanished. For the first time since his coronation, he felt completely alone. The silver mark upon his wrist, the blessing every alpha ruler inherited, faded before the eyes of the entire kingdom until nothing remained except ordinary skin. Gasps spread through the crowd. Some covered their mouths. Others stepped backward in disbelief. An alpha king without the moon's blessing had never existed in living memory. High Priestess Miriam tightened her grip on the ceremonial staff, her face pale with shock. She had served 3 generations of rulers and had memorized every sacred prophecy ever written. Yet even she had prayed this day would never arrive. Her trembling voice barely rose above the silence. The moon goddess has spoken. No lightning struck the palace. No earth trembled beneath their feet. The punishment was far more terrifying because it was quiet, undeniable, and witnessed by every soul standing beneath the night sky. Nathaniel looked toward the throne platform, where Queen Victoria Ashford stood frozen in expensive white silk. The jeweled crown upon her own head suddenly slipped loose and fell onto the stone beside her feet. She reached for it instinctively, but the moonlight reflecting across its surface disappeared, leaving only cold metal without blessing or meaning. Fear replaced confidence in her eyes for the very first time. Then the wind changed. A gentle breeze carried silver flower petals across the courtyard, although no flowers bloomed anywhere nearby. Every petal drifted in the same direction, floating past the throne, past the royal banners, past the nobles who had once celebrated power above compassion. They gathered around a single empty space near the palace gate, as though waiting for someone who was not there. High Priestess Miriam slowly closed her eyes. She already knew what the sign meant. The true Luna had never lost the moon's favor. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the woman chosen by destiny still walked beneath the same moon, carrying a bond no betrayal had ever broken. Nathaniel followed the petals with a broken expression as memories he had buried beneath pride returned one by one. He remembered a gentle smile, quiet kindness, hopeful eyes, and the promise he had once made beneath the sacred oak tree that he would never let anyone come between fate and love. The promise had been shattered by his own choices. The moon goddess had simply revealed what his heart had refused to face. As the cracked crown rested abandoned on the marble floor, and the silver petals continued their silent journey into the darkness, the kingdom watched its king lose everything beneath the very moon that had once chosen him. And far beyond the palace, destiny quietly waited for the moment the forgotten Omega's story would finally begin. 5 years earlier, the kingdom celebrated beneath banners of silver and blue while church bells echoed across the capital, announcing the coronation of its new Alpha King. Every road leading to Ashford Palace overflowed with hopeful citizens eager to witness what they believed would become the beginning of a golden era. Among them walked Grace Bennet, her simple ivory gown moving gently in the spring breeze as nervous excitement filled her heart. Hidden beneath the delicate lace at the edge of her collar rested the silver moon mark that had appeared on her 18th birthday, the sacred sign proving she had been chosen as the fated mate of Nathaniel Ashford. She had never desired wealth or power. She only believed that destiny could never be mistaken. Her older sister, Victoria Bennet, walked beside her wearing an elegant white gown adorned with jewels far more extravagant than Grace would ever choose for herself. Throughout the journey to the palace, Victoria smiled warmly whenever others looked her way, but whenever no one watched, her eyes drifted toward Grace with a quiet envy she carefully concealed behind practiced kindness. The great ceremonial hall shimmered beneath thousands of candles as nobles, warriors, priests, and village elders gathered beneath the towering stained-glass windows honoring the moon goddess. High Priestess Miriam stepped forward holding the ancient Book of Bonds while Nathaniel approached the sacred platform, wearing the royal crown for the very first time. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken as the silver moon mark beneath her collar gently warmed against her skin. Every story she had heard since childhood had promised the same miracle. When the Alpha King publicly accepted his true mate, the moon mark would glow beneath the blessing of the goddess, confirming a bond that no kingdom could challenge. Silence settled across the hall as Nathaniel began to speak. Grace lifted hopeful eyes toward the man she had loved from afar for years. Instead of walking toward her, however, Nathaniel extended his hand toward Victoria. The entire hall erupted into astonished whispers. Victoria accepted his hand without hesitation, lowering her eyes with graceful humility while hiding the smallest trace of satisfaction behind her smile. Grace stood perfectly still, unable to understand what she was seeing. High Priestess Miriam looked between the sisters, her expression clouded with unmistakable concern. But before she could object, one of the royal advisors stepped forward and calmly declared that political stability required the marriage to unite influential families. Nathaniel remained silent. He did not look toward Grace even once. Moments later, another decree echoed through the hall. Grace Bennet was stripped of every privilege attached to the future Luna and reassigned as a palace servant responsible for maintaining the royal library and eastern residence. The announcement struck the room with uncomfortable silence. Some nobles exchanged uncertain glances, while others lowered their eyes, unwilling to question their new king. Grace slowly bowed her head, not because she accepted the injustice, but because dignity was the only possession no decree could take from her. As she turned to leave the ceremonial platform, the silver moon mark beneath her collar suddenly shone brighter than it ever had before, hidden beneath the fabric where no one except High Priestess Miriam happened to notice its impossible light. The elderly priestess watched in stunned silence, for according to every sacred prophecy, the moon mark should have disappeared the moment a true mate was rejected. Instead, it burned with unwavering brilliance, as though the moon herself had quietly refused to recognize what the kingdom had just witnessed. Grace Bennet quickly learned that losing a title was far easier than losing hope. Before sunrise each morning, she swept the endless palace corridors while servants who had once bowed respectfully now passed without acknowledging her presence. She polished marble floors until they reflected the stained glass windows above, organized thousands of aging books inside the royal library, and carried fresh flowers to rooms she was no longer permitted to enter except for work. No complaint ever escaped her lips. The palace staff quietly noticed that although she had every reason to become bitter, she still greeted every cook, guard, gardener, and stable hand with the same gentle kindness she had always shown. Many found themselves returning that kindness in small, careful ways. An extra piece of warm bread appeared beside her evening meal. A fresh blanket quietly replaced one worn thin by winter nights. No one dared openly challenge the royal decree, but compassion often found its own silent language. Victoria settled comfortably into life as queen, surrounding herself with expensive gowns, jeweled crowns, and lavish celebrations. Yet despite every display of royal elegance, one thing refused to happen. During every full moon ceremony, the sacred blessing that traditionally surrounded the ruling Luna never appeared. Courtiers politely ignored the absence. Nobles invented explanations. Nathaniel accepted each excuse with growing frustration while convincing himself that the blessing would arrive eventually. High Priestess Miriam remained the only person willing to watch carefully instead of speaking quickly. Every month, she secretly observed Grace from a distance during the sacred ceremonies. Hidden beneath the collar of her plain servant's dress, the silver moon mark continued glowing with quiet, unwavering light. According to every ancient record preserved inside the temple archives, such a thing should have been impossible. A rejected bond should have faded long ago. Instead, the mark seemed stronger with every passing season. One rainy afternoon, Grace carried a stack of repaired books through the eastern courtyard when she noticed a frightened young servant struggling to calm an injured white dove caught beneath a fallen branch. Without hesitation, Grace carefully knelt beside the bird, speaking in a soft voice while gently lifting the branch away. The dove remained perfectly still in her hands before calmly spreading its wings and flying upward into the gray sky. Several nearby servants smiled with quiet admiration. Unseen by them, High Priestess Miriam watched from beneath the covered walkway. The old priestess lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Throughout history, white doves had often appeared in the oldest stories whenever the moon goddess wished to remind her people where true compassion still lived. Later that evening, Miriam unlocked the deepest chamber beneath the temple where only the oldest scrolls were kept. Dust floated through narrow beams of moonlight as she carefully unrolled a prophecy that had not been opened for decades. Her eyes slowly moved across faded ink until they reached a passage that made her heartbeat quicken. It read, "When the chosen mate is dishonored and forced beneath another's shadow, the moon shall not abandon her. The blessing shall remain hidden until truth stands beneath the full moon, and the crown worn without destiny shall one day return to the one who granted it." Miriam closed the scroll. With trembling hands. Outside, another full moon rose above Ashford Palace, shining with quiet patience over a kingdom that believed it had secured its future, unaware that every passing month was drawing it closer to a judgment written long before any of them were born. As the seasons quietly passed, the kingdom flourished on the surface while invisible cracks slowly spread beneath its foundation. Grace Bennet remained a servant within the palace, but beyond its grand walls, stories about her kindness began traveling farther than any royal proclamation. Farmers remembered the young woman who stayed after delivering books to help gather crops before an approaching storm. Elderly widows smiled whenever she carried baskets of fresh bread purchased with the small wages she earned from palace work. Children rushed toward her whenever she visited the village marketplace because she somehow remembered every name, every birthday, and every dream they had shared with her. She never spoke about the life she had lost, and because she refused to complain, the people gradually stopped seeing her as someone deserving pity. Instead, they quietly admired the strength that allowed her heart to remain gentle despite disappointment. Inside Ashford Palace, however, Queen Victoria noticed the growing affection surrounding her younger sister. Every compliment spoken about Grace felt like a shadow falling across her own accomplishments. Lavish banquets, expensive gowns, and carefully planned ceremonies earned polite applause, yet the simple gratitude Grace inspired could not be purchased or commanded. Victoria began assigning Grace longer hours and more demanding responsibilities, insisting that every task be completed perfectly before sunset. Grace accepted each assignment with calm determination, never arguing and never seeking sympathy. Her quiet resilience only deepened the respect others felt for her. Nathaniel occasionally caught brief glimpses of Grace crossing distant hallways or tending the palace gardens before dawn. Each encounter stirred an unfamiliar feeling that he quickly dismissed as simple guilt over the difficult circumstances created by royal duty. He reminded himself that stability required sacrifice, and that his marriage had secured important alliances for the kingdom. Yet every time he watched Grace comfort a frightened child or patiently help an elderly servant climb the palace steps, a strange sense of emptiness settled over him without explanation. Meanwhile, High Priestess Miriam continued her private investigation into the ancient prophecies. Night after night, she compared forgotten manuscripts preserved beneath the temple, discovering that every generation recorded the same warning in different words. Whenever an alpha rejected the mate chosen by the moon goddess, blessings did not disappear immediately. Instead, they slowly withdrew from the kingdom itself, allowing leaders every opportunity to recognize their mistake before judgment finally arrived. Miriam looked beyond sacred texts and began observing the land. The harvest moon rose full and bright, yet fields that normally produced abundant grain yielded smaller crops than expected. Forest streams that had flowed steadily for centuries became unusually shallow during the height of spring. Hunters returned with fewer successful expeditions despite favorable weather. None of these changes created panic on their own, but together they formed a quiet pattern impossible for the priestess to ignore. During the next royal council meeting, Miriam respectfully urged Nathanael to examine the old prophecies before dismissing the unusual signs surrounding the kingdom. Nathanael listened patiently, but offered a courteous smile instead of concern. He believed every challenge could be solved through stronger leadership, wiser planning, and greater determination. Ancient warnings, in his mind, belonged to another age. As the meeting ended, Miriam stepped onto the palace balcony and gazed toward the moon rising above the distant mountains. A flock of white doves crossed the silver sky in perfect silence, flying not toward the royal tower where kings had always received the moon goddess's favor, but toward the modest servant's residence where a forgotten Omega quietly folded freshly washed linens beneath the same sacred light, completely unaware that destiny was already preparing to reveal a truth no earthly crown could hide forever. Another full moon finally arrived, and with it came the Night of Silver Blessing, the most sacred ceremony in the Ashford Kingdom. For generations beyond memory, every Alpha King had stood before the moon altar on this night to renew the blessing that protected the kingdom, strengthened the pack, and confirmed that the royal family still walked in harmony with the will of the moon goddess. Citizens filled the Royal Moon Plaza long before sunset, carrying silver lanterns and white flowers while musicians played the ancient hymns every child had learned since birth. Hope still filled the air because traditions older than any living wolf had never failed. Nathanael stood proudly before the altar wearing ceremonial robes embroidered with silver thread, while Queen Victoria waited beside him beneath a magnificent white canopy. High Priestess Miriam raised the sacred crystal staff toward the full moon, and every voice in the plaza fell silent. According to custom, moonlight would soon descend upon the royal couple, surrounding them with a gentle silver glow that everyone would recognize as the blessing of the goddess. Grace Bennet watched quietly from the outer edge of the courtyard beside the palace servants. Her plain gray dress blended into the crowd, and no one except Miriam noticed the familiar silver light already resting beneath Grace's collar. The prayer began exactly as it always had. Ancient words echoed through the plaza while thousands lowered their heads in reverence. Nathanael lifted both hands toward the heavens with complete confidence. Seconds passed. Then another long moment slipped into silence. The brilliant moon above remained bright, yet no silver light descended upon the altar. The crystal atop Miriam's staff, which had always glowed during the blessing, remained completely clear. Murmurs slowly spread through the crowd. Some glanced upward in confusion, while others exchanged uncertain looks with family members standing beside them. Nathanael repeated the sacred prayer a second time, speaking louder than before, believing perhaps his voice had not carried clearly enough. Once. Again, nothing happened. Even the gentle breeze that normally circled the altar during every ceremony failed to appear. Victoria forced a composed smile, but her hands tightened around the edge of her ceremonial cloak. Nathanael's confidence slowly gave way to visible uncertainty. Miriam lowered the crystal staff, her heart sinking as every warning preserved inside the ancient prophecies unfolded before her eyes exactly as they had been written centuries ago. Then, without warning, a single white dove descended from the moonlit sky. It circled above the altar only once before flying gracefully across the plaza, ignoring the king, the queen, and every noble gathered below. Thousands of eyes followed its silent flight until it landed gently upon the stone railing only a few feet from Grace. The dove remained there peacefully, looking directly at her without fear. Grace smiled softly and extended one hand. The bird stepped onto her fingers with effortless trust before lifting into the air once more and disappearing into the silver night. The entire moment lasted only seconds, yet an uneasy stillness settled across the plaza. Nathanael instinctively turned toward Grace, meeting her eyes for the first time in many months. He could not explain why, but the emptiness he had carried inside himself suddenly felt heavier than ever before. High Priestess Miriam quietly closed her eyes. The moon goddess had not abandoned the kingdom without a sign. She had simply chosen not to place that sign upon the throne. As the ceremony ended without blessing, celebration, or explanation, the people slowly returned to their homes carrying questions no one dared ask aloud. While above the palace, the full moon continued shining with calm patience, as though waiting for the moment when truth would finally become impossible for even a king to ignore. The failed ceremony became the beginning of countless unanswered questions that drifted through the kingdom like leaves carried by an autumn wind. No official explanation came from the palace, yet everyone noticed that life no longer followed the quiet rhythm it once had. The river that supplied fresh water to the western villages receded. Weeks earlier than expected, orchards famous for their sweet fruit produced smaller harvests despite careful tending. Hunting parties returned with fewer deer crossing the forests, while healers quietly admitted that ordinary illnesses seemed slower to pass than in previous years. None of the changes were severe enough to create panic, but together they formed a pattern impossible to dismiss. Nathaniel refused to believe the kingdom had fallen out of favor with the moon goddess. He increased patrols, ordered additional grain shipments between villages, and held longer council meetings searching for practical explanations. Every advisor praised his determination, yet every solution seemed only to slow the problems rather than end them. Victoria encouraged lavish festivals and public celebrations, hoping cheerful displays would calm growing uncertainty among the people. Bright banners decorated the capital, musicians filled the streets with lively songs, and generous meals were served in the royal square. But behind every polite smile lingered the same silent question. Why had the moon remained silent? Grace Bennet continued living quietly inside the palace, asking for nothing beyond the opportunity to complete each day with dignity. Whenever supplies arrived from neighboring towns, she organized extra food to be delivered to elderly families before anyone noticed shortages. She spent evenings reading stories to children whose parents worked late in the market and mornings helping the palace gardeners rescue flowers struggling through an unusually dry season. She never claimed credit for any kindness, yet people increasingly associated peace with her presence. Guards found themselves smiling after brief conversations with her. Kitchen workers saved fresh fruit because they knew she would share it with others before keeping any for herself. Even visitors who had never learned her name remembered the gentle servant whose quiet compassion seemed to make difficult days easier to bear. High Priestess Miriam observed everything with growing concern. She reopened the oldest temple records and discovered another forgotten passage hidden between faded pages. It warned that when the blessing began withdrawing from a kingdom, the moon goddess first allowed the land itself to reflect the condition of its ruler's heart. Pride would cloud wisdom. Prosperity would slowly fade. Most importantly, the true bearer of the sacred bond would continue drawing hope wherever she walked, even without title or crown. Miriam no longer doubted what the prophecy meant. She only feared how much suffering would pass before truth finally revealed itself. One quiet evening, Nathaniel crossed the Eastern Palace gardens after another exhausting council meeting. As he approached the fountain, he noticed several children laughing beneath the old willow tree. Grace sat among them repairing a worn storybook while listening with complete attention as each child excitedly described impossible dreams of becoming explorers, healers, and scholars. For a brief moment, Nathaniel simply watched from a distance. Their laughter sounded effortless, untouched by politics or ambition. Grace looked up unexpectedly, and their eyes met across the moonlit garden. She offered nothing more than a respectful nod before returning her attention to the children. There was no accusation in her expression, no bitterness, and no request for recognition. That quiet grace unsettled Nathaniel more deeply than anger ever could. As he turned away, a cool breeze carried silver flower petals through the garden once again. They drifted past the royal palace without stopping, circling gently above Grace before disappearing into the night sky, leaving the king with an uneasy feeling that the answers he had searched for everywhere else had been standing silently within his own walls all along. The next full moon rose larger than anyone could remember, washing the kingdom in silver light that seemed almost alive. High Priestess Miriam summoned every noble family, every village elder, every royal advisor, and every member of the palace staff to gather once more before the ancient moon altar. Word had spread that the priestess would finally explain the silence surrounding the kingdom, and long before sunset the royal moon plaza overflowed with anxious faces. Nathaniel stood beside Victoria in complete ceremonial dress, though the confidence he once carried had faded into quiet uncertainty. His advisors insisted the gathering would restore public faith, but deep within his heart, he sensed that something far greater than politics was about to unfold. Grace Bennet arrived with the palace servants as she always had, wearing the same simple gray dress she had worn for years. She quietly took her place near the back of the crowd, hoping only to remain unnoticed. As the first rays of moonlight reached the altar, Miriam stepped forward carrying not only the sacred crystal staff, but also an ancient scroll sealed with silver wax. Her voice echoed across the silent courtyard. She announced that the time had come to reveal a prophecy hidden from the kingdom for generations because it was never meant to be spoken unless the moon herself demanded it. Every eye fixed upon the elderly priestess as she carefully opened the scroll and began reading the faded words preserved by countless generations before them. The prophecy declared that when an alpha rejected the mate chosen by the moon goddess, the sacred bond would never truly disappear. The blessing would remain hidden upon the true mate while slowly withdrawing from the throne until the kingdom itself recognized the truth. A ruler could wear a crown by human choice, but only the moon goddess could recognize a true king and a true Luna. Silence settled over the plaza so completely that even the evening breeze seemed to pause. Miriam slowly raised her eyes from the scroll and turned toward Grace. Before anyone understood why, she respectfully bowed her head. The movement shocked the entire gathering. One by one, the temple priests followed her example until every guardian of the sacred temple stood facing the humble servant instead of the royal throne. Victoria stepped forward in disbelief, insisting the priestess had misunderstood the prophecy. But before another word could be spoken, a soft silver glow appeared beneath the collar of Grace's dress. The light gently spread across the fabric until the hidden moon mark became visible through the cloth itself, shining with a brilliance unlike anything the kingdom had witnessed in decades. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Many instinctively fell to one knee, not before the throne but before the unmistakable sign of the moon goddess. Nathaniel stared at the glowing mark, and memories he had ignored for years returned with painful clarity. He remembered the warmth he had always felt whenever Grace stood nearby before his coronation, the strange emptiness that had followed her removal from his side, and every blessing that had quietly faded after his decision. His heart finally recognized what his pride had refused to accept. Grace had never lost the sacred bond because the moon goddess had never withdrawn it. Tears quietly filled Victoria's eyes as fear replaced every trace of certainty she had carried for years. She understood that no royal decree, no political alliance, and no jeweled crown could erase a destiny written by the heavens themselves. Above them, the full moon suddenly grew brighter, bathing Grace alone in pure silver light, while every bell throughout the kingdom began ringing on its own, announcing to every wolf within hearing distance that the truth hidden for 5 long years had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the judgment of the moon. No one moved as the silver light slowly faded from around Grace Bennet, because everyone understood they had just witnessed something that no decree, no title, and no royal command could ever erase. The truth had not arrived with anger or accusation. It had arrived quietly, carried by the light of the moon herself. Nathaniel felt the weight of every decision he had made pressing upon his heart. For 5 years he had convinced himself that duty required sacrifice, that the stability of the kingdom mattered more than destiny, and that time would silence the doubts that occasionally disturbed his sleep. Instead, time had only revealed how deeply he had mistaken pride for wisdom. Without waiting for counsel from his advisors or encouragement from the nobles surrounding him, Nathaniel slowly descended the marble steps leading from the royal platform. Each step echoed across the silent plaza until he stood only a few feet before Grace. She neither stepped backward nor reached toward him. She simply looked at him with the same calm dignity she had carried through every hardship. Nathaniel lowered himself onto one knee. A wave of astonishment swept through the gathered crowd. Never before had an alpha king knelt before a palace servant. Yet in that moment, he was not kneeling before a servant. He was kneeling before the woman the moon goddess had chosen long before he had ever worn a crown. His voice, once filled with royal certainty, carried only humility. He admitted that he had allowed fear, political pressure, and his own ambition to cloud his judgment. He confessed that every attempt to protect the kingdom through power had only weakened the very foundation upon which the kingdom stood. He did not ask Grace to restore his honor. He did not ask her to defend him before the people. He simply accepted responsibility for the choices that had separated him from the truth. Grace listened without interruption. The silence between them remained peaceful rather than hostile, allowing every person present to understand that forgiveness could never be demanded. After a long moment, Grace finally spoke with the same gentle voice that had comforted children, encouraged strangers, and carried hope through years of disappointment. She said that resentment had never guided her heart, because resentment only created new chains. She had forgiven him long ago, not because his actions had been acceptable, but because she refused to let pain determine the person she would become. Yet forgiveness was not the same as restoring what had been broken. Trust could not be rebuilt through a single apology, and destiny could not be rewritten by regret alone. Nathaniel lowered his head, accepting every word without protest. Nearby, Victoria quietly removed the jeweled crown from her own head and placed it upon the marble floor. Tears filled her eyes as she finally admitted that she had spent years trying to protect a life that had never truly belonged to her. She acknowledged that admiration earned through appearances could never replace the quiet respect Grace had received simply by living with compassion. High Priestess Miriam watched in silence, sensing that the most important victory unfolding before the kingdom was not the revelation of the true Luna, but the transformation of a proud heart into a humble one. Above the plaza, the full moon continued shining with steady brilliance, and for the first time in many years, a gentle breeze carrying the fragrance of white blossoms drifted across the gathered crowd, as though the moon goddess herself was waiting patiently for one final choice that only Grace Bennett would be allowed to make. The silence that followed felt sacred, as though the entire kingdom stood between the past it could never reclaim and the future it had not yet earned. Grace Bennett slowly lifted her eyes toward the radiant full moon, and the silver moon mark upon her neck glowed with a quiet warmth that wrapped around her like a promise kept across time itself. Then the moonlight above the Royal Moon Plaza brightened until every torch seemed insignificant beside its brilliance. A circle of soft silver light surrounded Grace alone, and the air filled with the gentle sound of unseen voices singing an ancient melody remembered only in the oldest temple records. No figure appeared before the crowd, yet everyone instinctively understood that the moon goddess had answered at last. High Priestess Miriam respectfully lowered her head and spoke with quiet reverence. She declared that the final choice belonged to no king, no council, and no prophecy. The moon goddess had returned the decision to the woman whose faith had never broken. Every eye turned toward Grace. She could have claimed the throne that destiny had always intended for her. She could have demanded every title that had been taken away. She could have accepted the crown waiting only a few steps from where she stood. Instead, Grace took a slow breath and smiled with the same gentle kindness that had carried her through 5 difficult years. She said that a true kingdom could never be built upon revenge, just as a true family could never be built upon fear. She did not desire power for its own sake, because the greatest honor the moon goddess had given her was not a throne but the freedom to choose the person she wished to become. She asked that every servant, every villager, every child, and every member of the pack be valued not because of birth or title, but because of the goodness they carried within their hearts. She asked that future rulers remember compassion before ambition and truth before pride. As her words faded into the peaceful night, a gentle silver beam descended from the moon and touched the broken royal crown resting upon the marble floor. Before the astonished eyes of the gathered kingdom, the cracked metal slowly dissolved into countless tiny lights that floated upward like stars returning to the heavens. Nathaniel watched the miracle in silence. He understood that the crown had never truly belonged to him. It had only been entrusted to him until his own choices proved him unworthy. Without hesitation, he publicly renounced every remaining claim to absolute authority and pledged to spend the rest of his life serving the people he had once believed he could protect through power alone. Victoria quietly accepted responsibility for her own choices as well, choosing a life of humble service within the temple where she hoped to rebuild her character through honesty rather than appearance. In the months that followed, the kingdom slowly healed. The rivers flowed strongly once again, orchards bloomed with abundant fruit, and the forests welcomed wildlife back beneath their ancient trees. The people chose new leaders guided by wisdom instead of ambition, while grace became the heart of the kingdom without ever asking to stand above it. Children who had once gathered around her as a palace servant now looked to her as an example of courage, patience, and unwavering grace. On quiet evenings, she often walked beneath the full moon smiling peacefully, no longer carrying the weight of rejection, because she had discovered a truth greater than any crown. Destiny could be delayed by human choices, but it could never be erased. And beneath the faithful light of the moon, the strongest soul would always be the one that chose kindness even after experiencing sorrow. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment, and what message or lesson did you take away from Grace and Nathaniel's journey? Share your opinion in the comments below and join the conversation with fellow story lovers. If you enjoyed this tale, please give the video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Omega's Secret. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next exciting story filled with romance, drama, betrayal, and unforgettable twists. See you in the next story.